Um, I think foreign policy in the convention and certainly during ratification is maybe not as big an issue as other things like consolidation or lack of a Bill of Rights or perhaps some of the many other issues that came up. But I think in a lot of ways it's clearly there and it's very, very important. And depending on which debates you read and which particular essayist you might read and which particular state ratifying conventions you're looking at, then I think issues that we would label foreign policy obviously played a critical role. Because again, this is a constitution being written in large part because of the weakness of the United States in the 1780s, as we've just talked about. A weakness diplomatically, a weakness militarily, a weakness in being able to patrol its own borders, which were ambiguous themselves, in dealing with Indian nations, in dealing with Spain and France and England. And so I think in many ways the Constitution was, Max Edling has a book entitled, with a thesis is essentially the title, A Revolution in Favor of Government, quoting a newspaper essay from 1788, I think.
87.
87.
Just before the Constitutional Convention adjourns, the Pennsylvania Gazette.
That's right, yeah.
Has this.
Yeah, and that's really, I think, what the Constitution was about. Stronger government, more consolidated government, more powerful government, in part to deal with these foreign policy issues. And so I think in many ways, when we look at the debates in the convention, all kinds of things get discussed, all kinds of things get debated as we see. But I think even when foreign policy is not on the table as the ostensible subject of conversation, you can't really get away from it, because I think there's so much that goes on in the convention and then even in ratification that is in many ways fundamentally about foreign policy, even if it isn't called that, even if it's an essay about union. You could argue that that's really in some ways about foreign policy and diplomatic concerns. Issues about confederacies or navigation or the power of government or the powers of Congress, those things I think are really key as well. So what I wanted to do is just sort of sketch out a couple of maybe brief things that we can talk about and that John can talk some more about, and then we certainly again want to open up things for questions and talk about what you'd like to talk about and ask about from this time period. One of the things that's critical, I think, that comes up at the convention certainly and in ratification is this question of the war power. You know, who gets to declare war? How is that done? What's that process like? Where in this new proposed government are you going to lodge the power to go to war? And is that going to be separate or the same as the ability to defend a nation? And how do you draw a distinction between that? Now you're going to look at, I guess tomorrow, the Pacificus Helvidius letters, which get into this entire question of who essentially drives foreign policy. Is that an executive prerogative or is that a legislative prerogative? So we can save that for tomorrow. But I think during the debates in the convention and in ratification, when the delegates are talking about things like the war power and also the treaty power, another related issue, it's really striking to note what they say and how they think about that in terms of what it reveals about their sense of how this new government can and should work, and also how they're afraid it might work. Because I think a lot of what's said and done and written is often to anticipate, well, this is going to go wrong, and here's where it's going to go wrong. This is a power that can be abused, or it can be misused. So if we define it too narrowly or too closely, then we might prevent some future leader, whether it's a president or Congress or both, from being able to respond to a situation as they need to. If it's too broad and vague, that might be paralyzing in its own way. And I think depending on where your sympathies lay in the 1780s, whether they were with greater consolidation and nationalization or less of that and more power at the local levels and the state levels, whether you believed in a strong executive or a much stronger legislature and a relatively weaker executive, I think all those decisions are also revealed in how you wrote about and spoke about these kinds of questions over war powers and declaration of war and treaty powers and these sorts of issues. So I think always, the debates in the convention and ratification also, I think, are always, I think of them as these multi-sided affairs. I mean, it's never simply about this. It's never simply about whatever the issue is that's on the table. There's so many other calculations and so many other considerations that are there. And I think when we read the framers and think about their points of view in any particular time, then when we read a debate and see the various sides of the debate playing out, then I think we can get a real sense for how the ideas are emerging and how they're developing in response to other considerations. And one of the things that's also, I think, critical to keep in mind with the convention, I mean, we all know this, but it's also easy to forget sometimes, is that the Constitution was a work in progress. And as the framers in Philadelphia were developing the Constitution, as different parts of it shifted, as the Virginia plan was gradually changed and modified in some ways, as new elements were added in, as new reservations were raised, as accommodations were made for that, as the various compromises were made, as the idea of the president began to change over the convention and the idea of the Senate began to change, all of these forced delegates to reconsider what they were doing and how they thought about the process and how they thought about where various powers could safely be lodged. Because nobody wanted a tyranny, obviously. You had to have a strong government and you needed to be strong enough to do what you needed to do. But where is that line between strength and tyrannical abuse of power? Where is that line between a strong, consolidated nation able to deal with foreign adversaries and threats to the Union, and a government that could be so overbearing that it could destroy individual rights and liberties? And I think as the Constitution is being constructed in those months in Philadelphia, then all these questions about foreign policy, just like all the other questions about domestic policy, are being rethought and recalibrated by the delegates who are listening and changing and adjusting. And if we think of it as sort of a whiteboard or things like that, Constitution looks like this in June. And by July it's shifted and looks like something different. And by August it's changed a little bit more as well. And as each of those changes are made, and you see changes to the executive department and the legislative department and powers divided between states and national governments, these all create a means of forcing people to rethink where they think it's safe to lodge certain powers and what checks on those powers can be created or now need to be created. So if you're granting these kinds of authorities and this kind of power, what kinds of safeguards will you create to make sure that's not somehow abused, either intentionally or simply because there's so much institutional power there that even if you're not trying to abuse a power, it would be hard not to anyway. So I think the idea of thinking of this as a work in progress and reading and thinking about the debates as this ongoing reconsideration is probably best exemplified maybe in the thinking of James Madison. And by the way, today is James Madison's birthday. We should raise a glass to James Madison, since he was born, I think, March 16, 1752, I think. So, 51, okay, that's right. So
I was there.
You were there. That's right. So, I mean, Madison was tremendously influenced by the debates in Philadelphia and by the convention and the development of the convention and the way the document began to shift over time. And he was unhappy with many of the changes that he saw, certainly. I mean, very few delegates in many ways were as disappointed as Madison by the final product of the convention, although he brought himself around to accept those as he thought and rethought and considered and weighed other arguments and finally came around to accommodate himself to things that he had previously thought would be disastrous. But I think Madison is probably the best example we can read to see how he is himself recalibrating where power should be lodged and then what safeguards should be introduced to protect against those powers if need be. But I think you can see that in many of the delegates themselves as they are thinking about the shift of votes and how they're going to gain majorities in the Constitutional Convention to push forward this or that element of the new plan. And I think, again, that foreign policy is one of those issues that was one of the signal weaknesses of the Confederation government. And everybody saw that at home and abroad. And so clearly a large part of what the convention and the new Constitution was designed to do was to remedy some of those weaknesses, to fix some of those problems and close some of those gaps that were so gaping, so enormous. So I think the convention, again, we tend to think about all the compromises between large states and small states and creation of the presidency and all the other sorts of compromises that took place there, 3/5 and everything else. But I think also one of the things that's sometimes lost as we think about the convention is the tremendous degree to which so much of what they did and thought about really touches on foreign policy concerns and foreign policy issues because they were so central at a time when the Republic was so young, so vulnerable, and so torn potentially internally, as well as being potential victims of overseas powers as well. So I think that's one of the things just to think about is that the issues being debated, foreign policy issues obviously came up as foreign policy issues, but I would suggest that foreign policy concerns never fade too far into the background of the debates in Philadelphia. Those things are always there in the minds of delegates, and as the Constitution is taking shape and as it's sort of shifting and morphing into different iterations, I think those concerns about foreign policy issues are always right there. Now, a second brief point that I would bring up, and again, we can come back and talk a lot more about these and other specific things that come up as well. One of the things I think that's interesting to think about, and I want to make this suggestive more than in the form of a strong argument or interpretation or things like that, but one of the things to think about, I think, is the way in which in the ratification contest, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, or critics of the Constitution, as Pauline Maier suggests we should think of them, not use the pejorative term that the Federalists use for the Anti-Federalists, how the Federalists and their critics thought about these questions of engaging with the world and whether and to what degree and how the new United States should engage with other nations of the world. Should the U.S.'s relationship be only commercial, or at least overwhelmingly and primarily commercial? I mean, we talked about the model treaty and how Adams states right up front, you know, we don't want any foreign armies here, we don't want any political configurations with other nations, we want open, free trade, free goods, we want a commercial relationship with other nations. What's the degree to which Federalists and Anti-Federalists differed on these questions of how the new United States should engage with the world? In what ways? And to what degree? And with all nations, with some nations, with particular nations in different ways than others? Should there be, in fact, some discrimination, to use the word that Madison would later use, in the way the U.S. treated the British and the French in terms of dealing with them and their goods? Or should all nations be considered equal? Or should the U.S. have, and this is a theme we'll get into a little bit tomorrow, should the U.S. have neutrality in the sense that we don't pick a side, but should we have a pro-British neutrality or a pro-French neutrality? Is it possible to be neutral and still lean one way as opposed to the other? So again, these are all questions I think that came up in the ratification debates, in the newspaper essays, as well as in some of the state ratifying conventions, as delegates were talking and thinking about these kinds of questions of how do we engage with the world. Norman Graebner wrote a piece about 30 years ago, I think, in Diplomatic History called something like Anti-Federalism and Isolationism. And I think Graebner's point there was that Anti-Federalists tended, he argued, to believe that the United States didn't need a whole lot of interaction with anybody else, that Anti-Federalists tended to believe that the U.S. should not be overly concerned with world affairs, that the U.S. was protected by bodies of water, that the United States as a continent could expand and grow and develop, and that from an Anti-Federalist standpoint, Graebner argued that there was not a great deal of interest in reaching out to and engaging in the world beyond trade, beyond commerce, beyond the kinds of things that had obviously long been going on back in the times when the the now United States, were colonies of Great Britain. So that question about isolationism, and again, that's an anachronistic term because I don't think anybody used that term at that time, but that idea of how much and in what ways the United States should or should not relate to the rest of the world is, I think, a very important one. And I don't know that I believe Graebner's argument. I don't know that that entirely holds up in that way, because he's pretty stark about drawing that connection between anti-federalism and isolationism. But I do think there was a large segment of Americans in 1787 and 88 who are not particularly concerned with anything happening outside of their borders. Or to put it differently, they're far more concerned with rights, with the structure and the shape of their own local governments. They're very concerned about relations between states. They're very concerned about the makeup of state and the new national governments. And for a great many of these people, they're not particularly concerned about becoming a great power on the world stage, which is clearly what Hamilton and some other Federalists were already thinking in terms of. They're not particularly concerned with carving out a place on the world stage for the United States in that way, and they're far more concerned with this question of simply, if not going it alone, at least tending to their home affairs first. So these are ways, I think, in which we might, if we were to go back and look at some of the debates and some of the conventions and things like that, the state ratifying conventions, begin to look for some lines of inquiry where we could think a little bit more about these questions of engagement with the outside world and how and if that broke down along Federalist, anti-Federalist lines. If it's that clean, if there are far more divisions and far more murkiness and ambiguity in that than an anti-Federalist, Federalist dichotomy would suggest. But I think, again, since foreign policy issues, and especially foreign policy weakness, was such a major factor of American political life in the 1780s during the Confederation era, it is certainly no surprise that these issues were front and center at the convention, and that they simply could not have disappeared, in fact did not disappear, during the debate over the Constitution, and then obviously not as the new government was getting formed, because that would become, as we'll see tomorrow, the source of so many conflicts and problems and debates and issues in the 1790s. So, I mean, with that, I'll stop. That'll be all I'll say for now. John can talk, and then we'll take questions and see what you'd like to ask about or talk about.
Okay. John Adams was asked in the Second Continental Congress for advice on how to write state constitutions. John Adams wrote the first Declaration of Independence for the United States. That was the resolution of Congress and the preamble on the 10th of May and the 15th of May, 1776. That said, the American states should write new constitutions amenable to the people, not to the crown. The reluctant rebel from New York, James Duane, said, Mr. Adams, that smacks of independence. Adams said in his diary, I smiled and I said, no, that is independence. And so he was advocating independence. But he realized he wrote it so badly, like a lawyer would write it. Whereas on such and such date, the king did this, whereas the king did that, whereas he was not the poet that Jefferson was. And Jefferson starts out, when in the course of human affairs. I mean, it's totally different than John Adams. But people realized that Adams was a good authority. And so he wrote letters, which eventually morphed into his thoughts on government. And in that he says, what wouldn't the ancient lawgivers of Greece have given to write constitutions for 3 million people? We have that opportunity now. It's ours. And Europeans looked at Americans, and what they saw was that we in Europe have written the Enlightenment. We have written what could be. Americans are doing it. They are living the Enlightenment. They are writing constitutions for themselves. And that's what Adams was advocating to do. He quoted Alexander Pope, the great English essayist, and poet. And are you familiar with Alexander Pope? Any of you have read Alexander Pope? He's wonderful to read. He writes a lot of poetry. Even his essay on man is not an essay, it's a poem, very long poem. Abigail Adams loved Alexander Pope. She quotes him all over the place because he's so quotable. Shakespeare's okay, but you got to really search for the nuggets. Alexander Pope, they're all over the place. But John Adams quotes Alexander Pope, "For thoughts on government let fools contest. That which is best administered is best." So he's saying it doesn't make any difference what the form is. For thoughts on government let fools contest. That which is best administered is best. Adams said, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever read in my entire life. Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. It does make a difference what the form of government is. It's not just the administration. You have to have the right form for the people. And that's what they were searching for. And they did this in their Articles of Confederation, in their state constitutions, and they had not succeeded too well. But when most revolutions sort of fall apart, they then wrote new constitutions, new federal constitution, and new state constitutions. And I can't remember the name of the prof at Stanford. He's taking over for Jack Rakoff.
Oh,
Jonathan.
Knapp.
Yeah, Knapp. I should have remembered it because he's got a book coming out, which I went over for him. And so, his book says you can't understand the original intent of the Constitution until you look at the first 10 years under the Constitution because of the debates. And he looks at 4 debates. The debate over removal of government officials, in essence, the Tenure of Office Act that Andrew Johnson violated many years later. But can the president remove officers on his own volition? Or if you need the Senate to confirm, do you need the Senate to unconfirm? Is the issue. The next would be the Bill of Rights, the amendments. The next would be Hamilton's plan, and then the debate over the Jay Treaty. With those debates that take place, that gives you a clue into the meaning of the Constitution. And so just as the Europeans look at the American experience and say they're living it, so Knapp is saying the Constitutional Convention was a theoretical consideration. But we put it into play, and now we're debating it in play. It's not a theoretical issue anymore. We're looking at those 4 issues, and we need to have that understanding to have an appreciation for what the Constitution will be. And so they debate on the Jay Treaty, the House of Representatives' involvement, and how you have a difference of opinion here. That is, treaties are the law of the land. That's a major, major issue in the debate over the ratification of the Constitution. But the House of Representatives is not. But at the same time, part of the supremacy clause says laws passed in pursuance of the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. And the House of Representatives is involved in drafting laws in compliance, in pursuance of the Constitution. So, can you have a law passed by the Senate and the House that's in conflict with the treaty? Which one takes precedence here? Are treaties supreme law of the land, or are state law, federal laws in compliance of the Constitution, the supreme law? And so that debate is fleshing out that theoretical debate over drafting and ratifying the Constitution. And so it's an interesting concept. I don't know when the book is coming out, but I went over it 10 months ago or so. So he's had it for a while back. Anyway, that's a consideration here. Just as Todd was alluding to, the Constitution is in flux. That's why there are no Federalists in the Constitutional Convention, and there are no Anti-Federalists in the Constitutional Convention. You can't have those two until you have a Constitution, because everything is in flux. You don't know what it's going to be in the final analysis. I mean, after all, there were 3 non-signers that were there at the end. 2 of them, George Mason and Edmund Randolph, came to the convention as nationalists. They left as, Mason left as a Virginian. Randolph left as he usually was, a chameleon, on the fence all the time, didn't know what side he wanted to be on, always on the favorite winning side. You had to test the wins. Anyway, so you're not a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist until the end, when you can take a position. and you have a solid Constitution that's going out. But one thing you can never, never lose sight of, and that is George Washington. When they're doing their drafting of the Constitution, it is always in the anticipation that Washington will be the first president, and Washington will not sell us out. There are two people who say Washington is America's most dangerous man: Thomas Jefferson and Hugh Ledley. You all know Hugh Ledley. I'll tell you about Thomas Jefferson. No, you don't know who Hugh Ledley is, do you? Anyone know who Hugh Ledley is? He's a Connecticut son of liberty. And he becomes an anti-Federalist in a totally Federalist state. But their position is the Constitutional Convention wrote the Constitution with Washington in mind as the first president, and they consequently gave tremendous power to him. Diplomatic power, military power, domestic power, and that's fine under President Washington, a man of honor, a man who had total power in 1783 and gave it up. But what happens under, these are Ledley's words, under President Slushington? What happens under him? Will those powers be properly executed and limited? Highly suspect, because of the nature of human nature and who we are, not to be trusted. And so Washington had that image, and with him as the anticipated first president, they gave a lot of powers to him. And he understood. He didn't say he said almost nothing in the convention, but he smiled at the right time and nodded and spoke afterwards. And so people understood what he wanted and his position would be. And they all had great faith in him. Now, in looking at the two sides, I think it was Patrick Henry who said this statement, but it's true of all the anti-Federalists. The fact that we need change, and everybody admits we need change, doesn't mean we should accept this despotic form of government that we've been offered. We've got alternatives afterwards. When we get rid of this despotic form of government that is so ambiguous and has so many possible pitfalls, we'll do a better job. I mean, these guys were sent there to revise the Articles of Confederation. They violated their trust. They violated the Articles of Confederation form of ratification. And we're to trust them? When there's ambiguity, they tell us, trust us. This is how it's going to be interpreted. I don't believe any of them. Put it down on paper. Don't trust. Cecilia Kennan, many years ago in the 50s, wrote an article, Anti-Federalists, Men of Little Faith. How wrong she was. I mean, these men, these anti-Federalists, they took it upon faith when the Federalists said, trust us, and we'll propose amendments that will safeguard all your concerns you have. Trust us. And they did. Many of them rued the fact that they did. So they were men with a lot of suspicion, but with great faith that it would work out. So don't adopt a obviously defective. Once the Federalists said, yes, there are amendments that are needed, I mean, that played into the anti-Federalists. Say, okay, it's not a perfect Constitution. There are faults in it. Let's get rid of those before we adopt it. I mean, the argument is, okay, let's look at the real world. And we got a contract between Todd and Tim. And it's obviously the city slicker here as Swoggled, poor Tim, the gullible Tim. And he's going to sign that contract. If he has any brains, he will, because this guy says, once you sign it, we'll alter the contract. We'll do things you want. If Tim has any brains, he'll say, no, we'll alter it before I sign it, rather than going into it and change it later. Let's get the amendments now. That's what the Anti-Federalists are saying. This is a dangerous instrument. Now, the Federalists have a comeback to this. And their comeback is, and Madison puts this forth, it's not imperative that we prove that the Constitution is perfect. All we have to do is to show that it's less imperfect than the Articles of Confederation. And a good example of that is the amendment procedure. The Anti-Federalists say it is very hard to get an amendment under the Constitution. Look at Article 5. The 2/3 of both houses of Congress or a constitutional convention, and then 3/4 of the states, either in legislatures or in conventions. Yeah, but look under the Articles of Confederation, unanimity of the state legislature. It's impossible to go that route. Isn't the Constitution better than that? And so the Federalist point of view is, yes, it's not perfect, but it's better than what we have, and we ought to go from there. Now, looking at the foreign policy issues, foreign affairs issues under the Constitution, I don't think there's any doubt that the issue of treaties is the main concern. Everyone pretty much accepts the fact that the president will have the appointment power. The way they don't agree is that the Senate has confirmation. The mixing of the separation of powers is not good. Senate should not have executive powers to confirm appointments and ratify treaties. But everyone is pretty much of the opinion that the president should have the appointed power. Maybe there should be a privy council that would help him, that would have responsibility. Responsibility is a key issue. Remember, it was about 3 years ago or so. Well, go back. It was about under President Reagan. 150 Marines were killed in Lebanon. And nobody was held responsible. The president, no military officer lost his job or was removed from the military. President Reagan says, I'm responsible. He wasn't impeached. Nothing happened to President Reagan. No responsibility whatsoever. And that's what the Anti-Federalists are worried about with the Senate. By voting the way they vote, and they can hide their vote, there'd be no responsibility. Remember 3 years ago or so it was, when the Chinese, the scandal that they were producing tainted pet food that was killing our pets? The CEO of that company was tried and convicted in China and executed. That's responsibility. You pay for your crimes here, and that happened there. In England, if the king can do no wrong, but the king's ministers can do wrong, and if the king's ministers do wrong in giving advice, they can be impeached and executed. Where is that responsibility in the American system? It's not there. So it's not a question of the president and his powers as commander-in-chief, although maybe he shouldn't take the field given what Caesar did in the field. But the president is pretty much okay, but it's the corollary powers that are questionable. And certainly when it comes to treaties, it's the question of supreme law of the land. And what you find is that Jay, he writes, we don't know how much of the Federalist Papers he originated. The standard argument is always Alexander Hamilton came up with the idea for the Federalist Papers, got Jay involved, and he and Jay and Hamilton decided on this. They parceled things up to write 25 essays. Jay writes 2 through 5. Hamilton writes number 1. Jay gets sick, and Hamilton scouts around. Who do I want to replace Jay? Is it William Dorr? No. Is it Rufus King? No. Is it Gouverneur Morris? No. Either no or they turn him down. Is it James Madison? Well, Madison says, I don't think so. I'm going to Philadelphia to visit my girlfriend, and if it works out, I'm not coming back. Well, it didn't work out. That wasn't Dolly. Dolly was another 10 years away or so. And so he did come back and did participate in the Federalist Papers. So it becomes the 3 of them. And Jay writes number 64. He writes 2 through 5, and then he's sick, and then he comes back and writes 64, which is on foreign affairs, which is understandable since he's Secretary for Foreign Affairs. So he writes that, and it's a rather disappointing essay. It deals only with treaties, that's all, no other foreign affairs issues in that number. But he does write 2 through 5, and it's a ridiculous series of essays. Charles Johnson in North Carolina says, what a waste of time and effort. He's only saying that the national government, central government, is better than separate confederacies. When I was at this one conference at Columbia in '95, not the one that you're referring to, I think, but there was an English prof there, a very prominent English prof. I can't remember his name, Blacksmith, Blackberg, something like that. And he writes on Paine and Jay, and his paper at that time was
Robert Ferguson?
What?
Was it Robert Ferguson?
Yes, it was exactly, and he this was Jay was so conciliatory to the Anti-Federalists in Federalist number 2 through 5. He didn't look at 64, and he didn't look at Jay's pamphlet later on in April, which is a conciliatory pamphlet, but 2 through 5 is not. 2 through 5 is to hell with you, Anti-Federalists. You are ignorant, and you are not only ignorant, but you are disunionites. You oppose the Union. Now, that's not true at all. I don't know there's any Anti-Federalist that is a disunionites. Certainly not as a group, they don't favor disunion. But he is saying that, and he's saying then in these 4 numbers, 2, 3, 4, and 5, why union is better than disunion. Everybody in America believes that. Do you need 4 numbers of essays to prove this point? I don't think so. And most Americans don't think so. But Jay does write these, and he, in essence, says one government is better than 3 or 4 or 13. Those are the possibilities of separate confederacies. North, South, and Middle, North, South, Middle, and West, or one for each state. And so he looks at the issue of treaties safety is what he's looking at, and how can Americans basically have safety, and it's through observance of treaties and not having violence, not having violence is possible, particularly when you're neighboring the British and Canada and the Spanish in the West, and where the violence takes place is the American settlements close to them. They are likely to have violence with the Spaniards and the British. It's the government in New York or Philadelphia that try to smooth it out. So the central government will try to be conciliatory toward these foreign entities, whereas the others will not. It's the state governments that I mentioned before that will get us involved in Indian wars, not the federal government. We will never go to war with Indians. And so that's Jay's perspective, that the federal government will be better in protecting uniform decisions that will be non-antagonistic toward other countries, and thus probably not get us involved in war, whereas the individual state actions might well get us involved in war. When you got one rogue state that can be very hostile toward a foreign country, that might get us involved in a war. But if the federal government comes down upon that recalcitrant state, you'll stop war from happening. And then finally, on the treaties, what he says is, you can't get better than the president and the Senate as being the operating force behind treaties. I mean, they're elected properly, that is by a diffused method, not the possible demagoguery of the people voting for members of the House of Representatives. They're older, 35 and 30 they must be, so they're established already. They won't be so young as in the House of Representatives. What you need in treaty making is secrecy and dispatch, quickness. The opportunity comes along. You got to seize it. If you don't seize it in days or even hours, maybe you lose the opportunity. The president can act quickly. The House of Representatives cannot, and there's no secrecy that's there. And so and the knowledge is there for the older folks. The staggered election, we never have a revolution in the Senate. We have evolution. There's always 2/3 of the Senate that remain. And so you have that kind of consistency, which you need, and the knowledge that these folks have with a 6-year term that they get, as opposed to the House of Representatives, which is transient. And so for all these reasons, it's proper that the president and the Senate are involved in treaty making. And the fact that treaties are the law of the land, other things are the law of the land too that are not legislatively oriented. That is judicial decisions. Where is the legislative action there? And yet these are solid, these are legal and binding. Presidential commissions, legal and binding with no legislative approval. And so you don't have to have the legislature sanctioning every single thing that government does. And so for all these things taken together, the method proposed for drafting and ratifying treaties is probably the best that could be achieved. So that's the argument that's put forth by Federalists. Anti-Federalists take a different point of view. They would want more involvement. They want, for instance, that there be a provision that state constitutions and bills of rights cannot be violated by treaties. I mean, everybody, all state officers holders have to take an oath to defend the federal constitution. Why shouldn't state constitutions be defended too? I mean, after all, there's no Bill of Rights in the federal constitution. The bills of rights are at the state level. So the rights of citizens are protected at that level, and they're vulnerable to treaties, which will be entered into without the House of Representatives. And our rights can be lost. Not only our rights, but our land can be lost, and our rights usage of land, i.e. Mississippi River, can be lost. We've seen the danger of that without involvement of the representatives of the people. And so they feel that there's something wrong with that the House of Representatives should be involved somehow in sanctioning treaties. So there are a number of other things. One of the things that I thought was most interesting that James Madison brings up in Federalist number 42, he says that there are things in the Articles of Confederation that are not precisely enforced and abided by. He says this earlier in the debate in the Confederation Congress when the Constitution is being transmitted to the states. He alludes to the fact that the land ordinance of 85 and 87, the Northwest Ordinance, are either unconstitutional or extra-constitutional because there's no explicit power to draft legislation for the territories. So this is beyond the real powers. Remember, Article 2 of the Article says that the states retain their sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and Congress has only those powers that are expressly delegated to it. There's no power to write legislation for the territories. So is that an extra constitutional action of Congress? Well, maybe it is. He says the articles say we can send ambassadors. Well, we don't send ambassadors in this country. We don't go to that level. We send ministers, minister plenipotentiaries, down lower. We send chargé d'affaires. We send consuls. Is this then a violation of the articles? We have no power under the articles to define piracy. We have the power to punish piracy, but no power to define. Therefore, we're forced to rely upon other nations' definitions of piracy or state definitions of piracy. It's a slippery slope, he's saying, when we start interpreting the articles and what we might do. The Constitution is much better because it spells it out. It says not only ambassadors, but other ministers, and broaden, and the power to define piracy as well as to punish for piracy. And so he's saying the Constitution is better in these areas of foreign affairs and to enforce the law of nations. The judiciary, the federal judiciary, will have the power to enforce the law of nations, which is far superior to what we have in the Articles of Confederation. So for those, but primarily the treaty issue, he's arguing Constitution is much superior. So, Todd, do you have any comments on what I said?
No.
Okay. Questions?
Are there any internationalists at the convention? I mean, I'm using that word internationalist, and maybe it's a presentist word, but other than Hamilton, maybe. Any internationalists at the convention?
Morris, Gouverneur Morris, maybe?
Sure.
Robert?
Well, Robert is to a certain extent too. But I'm not sure exactly what your definition of internationalist would be. I mean, there's certainly nationalists who want continental power. Hamilton certainly is a continentalist and internationalist of sorts. So I'm not exactly sure how far you go with an internationalist.
Well, in Morris's case, maybe commercial, or would you define them as commercial internationalists then?
Well, who was it that you said was an internationalist in the convention? Other than who did you say?
Other than
Maybe
Hamilton.
Morris
Other.
is commercial internationalist.
Yeah, Hamilton was the internationalist you referred to, though.
Sure.
Now, what makes him an internationalist as compared to, let's say, Madison or Washington or Adams? I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, just the fact that his speech that he gives, he lays out a very powerful national government that would be able to do some of those things on the international stage. So.
Well, he's a nationalist, and by having national power, certainly the others believe the same thing. They're nationalists, and that would give Congress the power and the president the power. So any nationalist, in that definition of the term, defining Hamilton as an internationalist, because he was a nationalist, certainly every nationalist, and there's half a dozen of them in the convention that would fall into the same category, I would say.
James Wilson, too, right?
Yes, sure. Yes.
Now that we've gotten into the U.S. being an independent nation, is there any interest in gaining treaties with, say, like China or other parts of the world?
Well, the trade is just starting. The Empress of China goes out in, was it 80, 84, 85, and comes back in 86. And there is an argument that Jay puts forth that the other countries, England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal, they're already dealing with the Far East, and they won't be receptive to our intrusion. That's not the case. Our ships go there, and a couple of them get into trouble, and the French go out of their way to help us and to aid those sailors. I mean, there's an unwritten law. When you're in trouble in the high seas, it doesn't matter what your color is, what your nationality is. You're rescued at sea. And so that's what happens. And so it's certainly there is a desire to open up the trade, and they see that it's quite remunerative. When Robert Morris's venture in the Empress of China comes back, it opens up the door for trade with China and other Far East countries.
Would you look at that tariff power also as being, I mean, not maybe at the level of the war powers and that treaty power, but is that tariff power in Article 1, I think it's Section 8, is that also a way of that international relation thing too? You can, you talked earlier about that most favored nation. The use of that tariff power, is that?
Sure.
Could be, yeah,
Good.
certainly. Yeah, I mean, I think so. That's one of those other parts of it's sort of a foreign policy issue that's kind of embedded in there, I think, right? It's clearly there. It's clearly one of the things that they're talking about, because I mean, tariffs, again, that's a major policy consideration. I mean, it would be throughout the entire 19th century. I mean, it is back in the news again, obviously. So I mean, that's something that never quite goes away. And I think that's one of the many economic arguments that Federalists made for adopting the Constitution, to put the country on a much firmer footing economically, and to put it in a position to be able to deal from a position of strength with other nations in terms of trades and tariffs.
Even before the articles are accepted officially, March 1st of 81, when the Delaware delegates sign, but in February of 81, the impost of 81 is proposed to give Congress a 5% ad valorem, 5% across the board, tariff power, the revenue of which would be earmarked to pay the wartime debt. And it gets everybody's approval except for Rhode Island. It kills it. Then in 83, they provide a couple of amendments, one of which is the impost of 83. Again, now an impost, but limited for 25 years. 5% ad valorem to pay the wartime debt. And it gets every state to be ratified. They ratify. Although the interesting thing is, and I think this is so important, but sometimes it goes over the head of people I'm speaking with, and others, they don't think it's important. But every state that ratifies the impost of 83 puts in a proviso that there was going to be a American Customs Collection Service, right? If you have a federal tariff, and then there'll be a judiciary trying citizens of different states who are charged with smuggling. The provisos in there said that the federal judiciary will not violate the rights of our citizens, as mentioned in state constitutions and state bills of rights. Just think of what that does. Just think of what that is saying. That is saying that 50 years before Gitlow, 1925, where for the first time the U.S. Bill of Rights was incorporated onto the states, back in 1786, the states are saying the state bills of rights are incorporated onto the federal government. They can't violate the rights of our citizens. It's a remarkable thing that they're saying. And so tariffs are very important, and very important commercially for international affairs, but also domestically. The Federalist argument is, except in time of war, but in regular times, basically the tariff will be sufficient to provide the revenue that we need. There will be no necessity of a land tax or a poll tax. Well, they say no excise tax. That comes about, obviously, under Hamilton's plan. But they're basically saying the tariff will be sufficient. And so it's an important issue, the tariff.
And to follow up on that tariff thing, we talk about how the tariff was involved in the compromise part. What was the debate on tariffs? Were there stronger tariffs in the North desired, less tariffs in the South? What was the crux of this compromise on tariffs?
I would say there's a broad issue at first, and it's very much a continuation of the issue in the Revolution. New York, for instance, its adoption is not approved by Congress, and that is what causes the impost of '83 to fail. And Congress says to New York, reconsider it. They do reconsider in February of '87, and they say, we're not changing it. What they say is, we'll give you the money. We won't give you the power. That is, we're going to have the customs collectors as New Yorkers, and we can hire and fire them, and we'll supervise the collection of the money. But we're not going to give you that power. You tell us what you need from us, and we'll pay you. Very much what the colonies are saying, we'll pay what we think is appropriate. You tell us what is appropriate. We just don't want you telling us how we're going to pay, because you don't know what we can afford and who can be taxed here. We don't want you involved in our domestic taxation. You can get involved in regulation of trade, but don't get involved in our internal taxation. And so there is that level that's there. I was uncertain when I read Abraham Yates Jr. He writes under various pseudonyms. He writes under Brutus, I think he writes under I can't remember the other name, but in 1786, he says that the impost of '83 is unconstitutional. So I started looking, where is it unconstitutional? I'm looking at the New York Constitution, where is it unconstitutional? And it's not there. But it is there. And it says in the very beginning that all powers derive from the people. And New Yorkers will not give up the power to tax. So that's what he's talking about. They should not delegate that power to the central government. They should keep that power. Yes, they will give the money, but they won't give the power. And that was one of the objections to the New York ratification. They wanted to appoint their customs officials. Sure.
Looking for the Federalist paper or another primary document, when they decide to divide kind of control of who declares war in the military, when they want to keep the power of the army with the people in the legislative branch, but yet they choose the president and the executive branch as the commander-in-chief. Is there something that's written on how they came about that position or how they defend that position that you can think of in any of the Federalist Papers or documents?
That's from what, Federalist 68 to 74, is it? That is the executive?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is Hamilton.
Yeah, all Hamilton.
He does explain that whole process
Well, yeah, and I mean, one of the big changes, first of all, they wanted to make peace easy, war hard. And therefore, to make peace one person, and again, opportunity that I mentioned before. There's a limited window sometimes, and you got to seize it when it's available. So you want to get out of war fast. You want to get in war slowly. That's why it takes the vote of Congress to declare war. So they understand that. And you want unification leadership here. But it's interesting that they go for a 2-year appropriation for military to put that kind of control in Congress, that the military won't be, and they exactly won't be able to run whole hog because they're limited to a 2-year appropriation. Well, in England, the mutiny bill law which was paying for their army was an annual thing, not a 2-year thing. And I remember when my son, this is many years ago now, went to UW Whitewater, and I took him for the orientation where the students went away and the parents were there in the auditorium. And there were half dozen undergraduates, half co-eds, half men, boys, and they were answering any questions that we had. And one mother in the back raised her hand and says, I understand you have here co-ed dorms. Is that so? And what do you mean by that? Girls, boys, girls, girls, boys. What do you mean? Co-ed dorms that you have here? And one of the girls, students said, no, it means this apartment is girls, this apartment is boys, right together. Not to worry. Every dorm adopts a rule that says members of the opposite sex cannot be in the room for longer than 48 consecutive hours. This mother said, what can't they do in 48 hours? And that's exactly what the anti-Federalists were saying here. What can't they do in 2 years? You give them 2 years. Give the Army and the Commander-in-Chief 2 years of funding. What can't they do? They can do anything they want. And after all, there's this little bit of, if you don't ratify, we'll force it down your throat with the Army, with the Society of Cincinnati. The Caesar essays say this. We'll cram it down your throat. So the ones who are not threatening separate confederacies, but threatening the use of the Army to implement the Constitution are the Federalists. And so there's a bit of a fear of that and how it might be implemented. But the appropriation for the military sort of goes to limit the military, they think. But it's not strong enough for the anti-Federalists. They realize it's twice as long as they have in England to appropriate. Other questions?
You said it's Hamilton?
Yes.
Yeah, they're all Hamilton.
Yeah.
67 through 75.
Usually when it comes to power, Hamilton is the author. When it comes to safeguarding, Madison is often the author. Not always, but usually.